Hi everyone, my name is Shreyasee and I'll be presenting joint work with Shatanjaya Dasgupta, who's at Providence College. I'm going to be presenting our work that looks at marriage market outcomes when a natural disaster hits, and specifically we're going to be looking at this through the context of the 2001 Gujarat earthquake in India. Now, India provides us with a unique context for marriages, especially. Marriages in India continue to be a universal phenomenon. Divorce, in fact, is quite an exception even today. Large percentage of marriages continue to be family arranged. Women have a tendency to marry more educated men, which is educational hypergamy, but this is on the downward trend today. Caste homogamy still exists. There is a persistent practice of consanguineous marriages as well. And while dowry payments are illegal, there is a system of dowry payments that still exists even today during marriages. Well, our research question is going to be looking at the fact that Indian marriages provide us with this unique context. What happens to the formation of these marriages if we have an unexpected natural disaster? And we're going to specifically look at the 2001 Gujarat earthquake. And one of our primary mechanisms to explain these results that we're going to show you are going to be through the dowry payments that we're going to look at. Now, natural disasters are severe. In effect, they are usually unexpected, especially earthquakes where you cannot actually prepare for them. Losses run anywhere between 250 to 300 billion US dollars annually. There's no significant difference between the occurrences of these natural disasters between poor and rich countries. However, coping mechanisms of these for these natural disasters vary significantly. So institutional differences, how they handle these natural disasters, vary significantly based on lower middle income countries versus richer countries. These effects could also vary within countries as well. Within countries, the impacts may vary based on age, based on gender, based on socioeconomic status. And so we're going to be looking at a particular group of people. Natural disasters have disproportionate impact on women and girls. They're often overlooked in disaster management and mitigation policies due to various patriarchal, societal, cultural norms, often financial insecurity, and how gender division of labor exists. Women have disproportionate self-rescue responses. They're unable to help themselves during these disasters. They face greater mortality risks. They face lower life expectancies. Often they have much higher gender-based violence risk as well, because law and order is failing during these times. They face greater risks with respect to reproductive and maternal health, and there is evidence that shows that fertility also increases due to post a natural disaster. How do natural disasters actually affect marriages? We've seen some literature that talks about change in marriage and divorce rates. There is a budding literature that looks at age at marriage, what's happening to women's and men's age at marriage, and there's a whole host of papers that look at that. Papers have also looked at quality of marital matches, and this is especially with respect to the education of the spouses. And papers have also looked at what happens to the likelihood of consanguineous marriages. Do they increase or decrease based on how well a household is able to mitigate a natural disaster? So we're going to be contributing to this literature by looking at how disasters affect women's vulnerability through looking into the Indian marriage market. We're also going to be the first study that looks at this with respect to an earthquake in India. Now, what is the earthquake that we're studying? It is the 2001 Gujarat earthquake that took place on January 26, 2001 in Gujarat, which is a western state in India. Out of the 25 districts in Gujarat, 21 of them were affected. 6 of them were severely affected, and I'll talk about what these classifications mean in a couple of minutes. More than 20,000 people were killed, about 167,000 people were injured, 600,000 people were displaced, and the direct economic loss was about 2.88 billion estimated billion loss. Interestingly, the 2001 Gujarat earthquake also set off a national and state level disaster management policies all across. Three other studies have looked at the Gujarat earthquake, but they've looked at various other outcomes, some of them being the macroeconomic impacts of the disaster, and then also the fertility outcomes. And we enter this literature by looking at marriage market outcomes, and so we contribute to figuring out more of the comprehensive nature of the earthquake. Here's a map of the earthquake state. So this is the state of Gujarat. Anything in dark gray are the districts that were severely affected. Anything in lighter gray are the districts that were less severely affected. 4 districts were completely unaffected by the earthquake, and then we include Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra for our control group in our analysis. We use the IHDS data, the India Human Development Survey, the phase 1, which is 2004 to 2005. It's a very nationally representative data and has a whole host of household and individual characteristic information. We specifically look at the eligible women section that looks at married women between the ages of 15 to 49 years. And more importantly for us, we are able to identify the year of marriage for these women. We include women with years of marriage between 1996 to 2000, so that's our pre-earthquake period, and then between 2001 and 2005, which is our post-earthquake period. So we're going to be using a difference in difference strategy over here. The fourth source of variation comes from women's years of marriage. So if she was married after the earthquake, so 2001 and 2000 to 2005, she's part of the treatment group. But if she was married before the earthquake, then she's part of the control group. We also use a secondary source of variation. That's going to be our spatial or the geographical one. Districts in Gujarat affected by the earthquake, that's going to be our treatment group. And then the unaffected districts in Gujarat, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra are going to be our control group. Here's a standard differential equation. The outcome variable is going to be a lot of marriage related outcomes that we're going to look at. Post is pre and post earthquake. Affected is coming from the district variation. We have a whole host of control variables that we're using. And then we have district fixed effects, year fixed effects, and an error term. And the standard errors are robust and clustered at the district level. Here are our overall results. We find that women's age at marriage, suggestive evidence shown here, says that women's age at marriage is decreasing by about half a year. However, that is not significant. Their spouse's age at marriage, however, is significantly decreasing at the 10% level. And we find that it is decreasing by about 0.85 years. We find evidence that spousal education gap is increasing by about 0.75 years. And the likelihood of women marrying more educated spouses has increased by about 11 percentage points. We do find evidence of the fact that the probability of women marrying better off status households decreases by 7 percentage points. So if we were thinking about what kind of matching is taking place with respect to economic status between her natal household versus her marital household, what we notice is that there is a decrease in the likelihood that she marries someone who is better off than her natal household's economic status. We also try to figure out if there is any significant difference in terms of them marrying outside their village, and we find no evidence of that. We also find no evidence of consanguineous marriages. We look at the decision-making abilities in terms of her own marriages, and we divide the types of marriages between self-arranged, parent-arranged with consent, and parent-arranged without consent. What we notice is that there is a significant decrease in the likelihood of these marriages being self-arranged. So there's a 5 percentage point decrease in the likelihood of this of her marriage being self-arranged. We do find an equal increase in parent arranged with consent. However, that's not significant. Now, you could say that it's going to depend on whether the individual was living in a district that was severely affected by the earthquake versus not severely affected by the earthquake. And so what we're going to do is borrow some information that some papers have provided us with respect to severely versus less severely affected classifications. The Lahiri et al. Paper looks at total number of casualties and injuries, and we do a secondary check for this with respect to destruction of housing stock from the Edinburgh paper as well, and more or less they match quite well. So based on this, we just try to get the heterogeneous effects of severely affected versus less severely affected, and change our different equation a little bit. Here's what we find in terms of the severity of the earthquake. For women who are in the severely affected districts, we now see a very significant decrease in age at marriage. It's about a whole year. Same thing we see for their spouse's age at marriage as well. What we saw before with respect to spousal education gap increasing, we see that play out over here in column 4 for both severely and less severely affected districts. And again, the control group, the omitted group over here is the unaffected districts. Spouse more educated, the probability of a woman's spouse being more educated than her now increases by about 20 percentage points in the severely affected districts, and we see no evidence of same caste or better off status spouses in our results over here. We do see some evidence of the fact that post the earthquake in severely affected districts, the spouses are not from the same villages. So we see a 6% decrease in the likelihood that the marriages are from the same village. We do now find some evidence of the fact that consanguineous marriages are actually decreasing. So this could go back to the idea that maybe we have altruistic parents over here who are trying to find spouses who are outside of the village network or within their own network. And we continue to see decrease in self-arranged marriages, something that we saw before as well. Now, one thing we wanted to do is whether the difference between the severely and less severely effect actually shows up here. And what we find is the statistic for all of the coefficients, most of the coefficients is statistically insignificant. And so what we can say is that even though the results are actually not varying by severity of disaster, what matters is whether you got the shock or not. Now, we explore a few mechanisms. The first mechanism that we're looking at is the marriage squeeze effect. Now, one could say that because there were so many deaths, what could have happened is that the pool of people that were available to get married has now changed. So if you have more women than men, this could completely change the way we're thinking about the marriages. And also, if you have more educated men versus more educated women, those could play a role. So to do this, we look at two data sets. One is the casualties data that the Lahiri et al. Paper is also using to estimate their casualty figures by age and gender. And what we notice is that from their estimates, 55% of the casualties are amongst the age group of 15 to 59. And within that age group, 51% of the deceased group is male. So 49% is female. So it's not that much of a difference in terms of the sex ratio of the death toll. Same exact thing we look at from the 1991 to 2001 census, and we notice a very similar trend come up as well. So because of the lack of a substantial change or significant change in the sex ratio over the decade, we can rule out the possibility of marriage squeeze effects. Now, we also try to look at natal household behavior. Now, the cost of having an unmarried daughter post-earthquake could have increased. So what parents could do is that they could rush off to marry their daughters so that they had one less mouth to feed, one less member to feed. However, the argument could be made, what is the rationale then for the groom's family to take her in? Now, what could happen is because the groom is taking on another family member, they could ask for higher dowry payments. And there's some evidence also that says that the marital household could use these dowry payments to finance their own daughter's wedding. What could also happen is that parents are willing to accept lower quality marriages, and so what they could do is rush off their daughters into marrying, and also this could lead to a decrease in the probability of marrying into economically better off households. So based on the geographic search model from the Fulford paper as well, what could happen is that altruistic parents could find their spouses, daughter spouses from another village because they're thinking about shielding them from any other shock that could happen some other time. And what could also happen is we could see that, because of increased search costs, we could also see an increase in consanguineous marriages, something that we don't see over here. But however, we're not able to actually empirically test this result simply because we don't have the data to do so. But we do find some evidence of parental desire to smooth out and mitigate income risks from earthquakes based on our same village results and consanguineous marriage results. Most importantly, we really want to explore the dowry payments and the relationship of dowry payments to women's age at marriage and women's education. Now, age at marriage and dowry payments are related to each other. Parents could delay marriages, especially after an earthquake or any natural disaster, because they could be struggling to pay for dowries and associated wedding expenditures. But what they could also do is marry off their daughters early if they decide on having very modest wedding expenditures. What could also happen is that folks could have preferences for younger brides because they could be more docile and they could be more conforming to the household, to the marital households wishes, and so there could be a push to get a younger bride. Women's education, on the other hand, is also related to dowry payments. There could be an increase in this based on the fact that you're now competing for better educated husbands. Education could also be a reliable proxy for women's parental wealth. So again, women's education could lead to increase in dowry payments. And again, there's evidence of the fact that dowries do serve as a pre-mortem bequest. So what we're going to do is based on this from the IHDS, even though the IHDS does not have direct information on dowry data, they do have some indirect dowry data. What they ask is, in your community, for a family like yours, at the time of the marriage, how much money is usually spent by boys and girls' families? And we're going to use two measures as proxies for dowry payments, something that's also done in the literature quite a bit. We're going to look at gross wedding expenditure, which is the average expenditure amount by the girl's family. And this is in 10,000 rupees. And then we're also looking at net wedding expenditure, which is also very prevalent in the literature, where we're looking at the difference between the average expenditure by a girl's family and the boy's family. And this is again in 10,000 rupees. Here's our estimating equation. Wedding expenditure is just the dowry proxy outcome that I just went over. This is reported by women. This is the reported expenditure that the women who are being asked this question are responding to. Marriage age, again, is the women's age at marriage. Alpha 0 is our main coefficient of interest, and this is going to give us the differential effect on wedding expenditures by age at marriage in the affected districts after the earthquake. If it's greater than 0, then expenditures are rising when women delay marriage. If it's less than 0, then it means that there's an inverse relationship between women's age at marriage and wedding expenditures. We also modify this based on severity of earthquake, just to make sure that we understand if the earthquake's intensity plays a role over here or not. Before we do that, we wanted to just show you the correlation between age at marriage and net and gross wedding expenditure. And we see a very strong relationship, positive relationship between age at marriage and the wedding expenditure amounts. Here are our results. If we look at just the entire sample of our analysis, we find no significant difference between net, gross expenditure, and also based on the intensity of the earthquake. But then we look at when net expenditure is greater than zero. This is mostly the case where women's family is actually spending a lot more on the weddings than the grooms. So this is women's family expenditure minus groom's family expenditure, and this is often the case that it is greater for women. And we notice that there is a significant difference when we look at severely affected districts. And what we find is that for every year of marriage, every year of delay in marriage, dowry payments, net dowry payments go up by 4,400 rupees, and gross dowry payments go up by 9,200 rupees. So this is telling us that in a severely affected district, for every year delay in a woman's age at marriage, dowry payments have gone up. So giving us some positive relationship between age at marriage and dowry payments. So to conclude, we look at the impact of the 2001 Gujarat earthquake on marriage market outcomes. Our results indicate that women's and men's age at marriage is decreasing. We find more of a significant result for the men's age at marriage. We find a decrease in probability of marrying someone from the same village, especially for a severely affected district. We find evidence of increase in spousal educational gap and educational hypergamy, and this is consistent regardless of the intensity of the earthquake. We do find some evidence of a decrease in probability of women marrying off into better off households. When we mean better off, we mean in terms of their marital households being better off than their natal households. And then we find some evidence of decrease in probability of consanguineous marriages. We look at a whole host of potential mechanisms, and we're thinking about dowry payments. And we do find evidence of delaying women's marriage could actually increase wedding-related expenditures. So our theory that women are being married off earlier to potentially save up on expenditures shows up over here. Now, again, this is quite important for us to continue to examine. Women's marital prospects could all obviously have long-term life outcome related implications as well. And so going forward, disaster management policies should think about including women and adolescent girls increased risk of vulnerability because of these natural disasters when they're thinking about planning and when they're thinking about mitigation, when they're thinking about rehabilitation and relief efforts post natural disasters as well. Thank you so much.